It was March 26, 1960, at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. And Frank Sinatra was about to do something that everyone in that room understood was either an act of extraordinary generosity or a very public gamble. The Fontainebleau ballroom that night held roughly 400 people. But they weren't ordinary people. Cameras from ABC were set up along the back wall. Journalists from every major publication in the country had been given floor access. Celebrities who never attended other people's television tapings had cleared their schedules to be in that room because everyone understood that what was happening here was something you didn't want to miss. Frank Sinatra, the most powerful entertainer in America, was sharing his stage with Elvis Presley. And nobody in that building quite knew how it was going to go. Sinatra was 44 years old. He was at the peak of his power, not just as a singer, but as a cultural force. The Rat Pack, the Capitol Records years, the Academy Award. He had rebuilt himself from nothing after his career collapsed in the early 1950s. And what he had built the second time was something almost untouchable. His audience wasn't screaming teenagers. It was adults, sophisticated people, people who believed, and Sinatra had encouraged them to believe, that real music required craft, restraint, and a certain dignity that rock and roll simply did not have. And then there was Elvis. Elvis was 25 years old, just 19 days out of the United States Army, standing in a tuxedo on the edge of that stage. He'd been in Germany for 2 years. 2 years away from recording studios, from concerts, from everything that had made him the biggest thing in music. The industry had spent those 2 years wondering whether his moment had passed, whether the kids who screamed for him in 1957 had grown up and moved on, whether the Army had softened something essential in him. Elvis himself wasn't entirely sure, but here is what made that room feel electric before a single note was sung. Sinatra had spent years making his feelings about rock and roll completely clear. He had called it deplorable. He had said it was sung, played, and written for the most part by cretinous goons. He had testified before Congress about its corrupting influence on American youth. He had been public, specific, and merciless about it, the way only Sinatra could be. The man did not whisper his opinions. And now, Elvis Presley was standing in his ballroom, in his tuxedo, on his television special, the same Elvis Presley that Sinatra had been talking about. Have you ever been in a room where two things that weren't supposed to go together were suddenly in the same place at the same time? That is what the Fontainebleau Ballroom felt like that night. Reporters were watching Sinatra's face for any sign of condescension. Musicians in the house band were watching Elvis for any sign of nerves. The celebrity audience was watching both of them, trying to figure out whether this was going to be a coronation or a collision. Elvis stood there straight-backed, chin level, the tuxedo doing exactly what Colonel Parker had intended it to do. He looked like he belonged in that room. He looked calm. But the people standing closest to him later said his hands were not entirely still. Sinatra was already at the microphone, working the crowd the way he always worked a crowd, which is to say effortlessly, with the complete confidence of a man who had never once doubted he was the best person in any room he walked into. The audience was his. They were always his. That was the natural order of things in 1960. What none of them knew was that in about 4 minutes, Frank Sinatra was going to stop the show, turn to Elvis, and say something that nobody in music history had ever said before. 3 years earlier, Frank Sinatra had told a congressional committee that rock and roll was the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it has been my displeasure to hear. He wasn't finished. He called it the music of cretinous goons. He said it appealed to the most negative and destructive elements in young people. He said it with the full confidence of a man who had no reason to believe he would ever have to take any of it back. In 1957, Frank Sinatra was the undisputed king of American popular music. He had the voice, the Rat Pack, the movie career, the Vegas residencies, and 30 years of recorded proof that he was the greatest entertainer alive. Rock and roll was a fad. Elvis Presley was a phase. That was the prevailing wisdom in Sinatra's world, and Sinatra said it out loud because he believed it completely. What makes this complicated is what was happening on the other side of that cultural wall. Elvis Presley had grown up worshiping Frank Sinatra. Not in the casual way a teenager admires a pop star, deeply, seriously. Elvis had studied Sinatra's phrasing the way a music student studies a master. He listened to how Sinatra bent a note without breaking it, how he could make a lyric feel like something happening right now instead of something written in a room. Elvis once told an interviewer that Sinatra was the greatest entertainer who had ever lived, and he meant it without qualification. The irony of that is almost hard to sit with. The kid who idolized the king was now the reason the king felt threatened, because that's what it came down to. By 1958, when Elvis shipped out to Germany for his army service, he had already done something Sinatra's generation didn't think was possible. He had changed what people wanted from a performer. Teenagers weren't listening to ballads anymore. They weren't buying the kind of polished, sophisticated music that Sinatra built his entire identity around. They wanted something physical, something raw, something that made their parents uncomfortable. Elvis gave them that, and Sinatra, whether he admitted it or not, could feel the ground shifting. So how did they end up on the same stage? The short answer is that ABC needed a ratings event, and Colonel Parker saw an opportunity. The longer answer tells you more about the moment we were living in. ABC came to Sinatra's production team in late 1959 with the pitch for a welcome home television special built around Elvis's return from military service. The network understood what his return meant for viewership. 2 years away had only made the curiosity bigger. The country wanted to see if he still had it. Sinatra's team understood the numbers. A show built around Elvis's comeback would draw the kind of audience that Sinatra's regular specials simply couldn't match on their own. Colonel Parker negotiated hard. He always did. Elvis's appearance fee was reported at $125,000, which was extraordinary money for a single television performance in 1960. But Parker also understood what the appearance meant beyond the check. Sinatra's stage wasn't just a stage. It was a legitimacy machine. It was a signal to the adult audience that had written Elvis off as a teenage sensation that maybe there was more here than they'd allowed themselves to believe. Sinatra agreeing to the deal was, by itself, a kind of quiet admission. He didn't have to do it. Nobody forced Frank Sinatra to put Elvis Presley on his television special. He could have filled the hour with Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. and Joey Bishop and never looked in Elvis's direction. The fact that he said yes meant something. It meant that on some level, even Frank Sinatra understood that the world had moved and that pretending otherwise was no longer a position he could hold. He never said that publicly. Sinatra wasn't the kind of man who announced a change of heart, but the deal was signed, the date was set, and whatever he thought about rock and roll and the goons who made it, he was now in business with the most famous rock and roll singer on the planet. And now, after 2 years of army service in Germany, Elvis Presley was walking into Frank Sinatra's world, wearing a tuxedo, trying to look like he belonged there. Elvis had been out of the army for exactly 19 days when he walked into the Fontainebleau ballroom for rehearsal. And by every account from people who were there, he was terrified. Not the quiet kind of nervous that most performers shake off once the music starts. This was deeper. This was the fear of a man who understood exactly what was at stake and had no way to know if he still had what it took to meet it. 2 years in Germany had kept him physically sharp and professionally still. No recordings, no performances. No way to know if the thing that had made him Elvis, that raw, instinctive electricity, had simply sat in a drawer while the rest of the world kept moving without him. Colonel Parker had thought hard about every detail of how Elvis would appear that night. The tuxedo was deliberate, not a costume, a statement. Parker wanted Sinatra's audience, the supper club crowd, the adults, the skeptics, to see someone who belonged in their world, someone grown up, someone who had traded the shaking hips and the sneering lip for something that looked, at least on the surface, like polish. Elvis wore it without complaint. But people who knew him said he felt like he was wearing somebody else's clothes. The ballroom itself was overwhelming. The Fontainebleau was designed to make you feel small if you weren't certain you deserved to be there. High ceilings, crystal everywhere. The kind of room that swallowed amateurs whole. Elvis walked in and stood for a moment at the edge of it, just taking in the size of the thing. Joe Esposito, his road manager, was with him. He remembered Elvis going quiet in a way that wasn't typical. Elvis was usually the one making everyone else comfortable. That afternoon, he couldn't manage it. Sammy Davis Jr. was the first of Sinatra's people to approach him. Sammy was warm, genuinely warm. He shook Elvis's hand and told him he'd seen him perform in 1956 and that the kid had something that came along maybe once in a generation. Elvis thanked him. He meant it. But he also knew Sammy was Sinatra's man, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if the welcome was sincere or simply gracious. Joey Bishop watched from across the room, quiet, assessing. The Rat Pack had a way of measuring people without letting you know you were being measured. Elvis felt it. And then Sinatra walked in. There's no dramatic story about what happened when they first saw each other face to face. No confrontation, no big moment. That was almost the problem. Sinatra crossed the room, introduced himself the way you'd introduce yourself to anyone, shook Elvis's hand, and said something polite about being glad he'd agreed to do the show. pleasant, professional, completely unreadable. Elvis had spent years performing for crowds and learning to read a room the second he walked into one. He couldn't read this one at all. Have you ever been in a situation where the silence from someone you respect tells you more than anything they could actually say? That's what this was. Elvis had grown up listening to Sinatra, had studied his phrasing, his timing, the way he could hold a note just long enough to break your heart without ever pushing it too far. He had called Sinatra the greatest entertainer alive. And now they were standing in the same room, and the man whose records Elvis had worn out as a teenager was looking at him the way you look at something you haven't decided about yet. Elvis told friends later that the rehearsal was one of the loneliest hours of his professional life. Not because anyone was unkind, because everyone was watching. Every musician, every crew member, every member of Sinatra's inner circle was quietly taking stock of this kid in a tuxedo who had shaken the whole world and then disappeared for 2 years, and now needed to prove he could still shake it. Sinatra had said almost nothing to him during rehearsal, just nodded, watched, and returned to his own preparation. And that silence was somehow more unnerving than any insult could have been. Sinatra was midway through his introduction when he stopped, turned to face Elvis directly, and the smile on his face shifted into something else entirely. Something that looked less like warmth and more like a dare. The first 40 minutes of that broadcast had been pure Sinatra. The big band was locked in, all brass and precision, the kind of sound that filled a room without trying. Nelson Riddle's arrangements moved through the ballroom like something physical. Sinatra worked that stage the way he always did. Unhurried, completely in control, making every person in that audience feel like he was singing just for them. The celebrities in that room, and there were dozens of them, gave him exactly what he expected. Rapt attention, applause, right on cue. This was his world, and everyone in it knew the rules. Then, the moment arrived. Sinatra stepped to the microphone and began the introduction. His voice was smooth, almost casual, the way a man sounds when he's saying something he's thought about carefully but doesn't want you to know that. He acknowledged Elvis's service. He said something gracious about the Army. The audience was warm, receptive, ready to watch the handoff happen cleanly and professionally. This was supposed to be a courtesy, a moment where the established star welcomed the returning one. Everybody shook hands, everybody looked good, and the broadcast moved on. That's not what happened. Sinatra paused. He turned his body toward Elvis, who was standing just off the microphone, and the room shifted in a way that didn't make sense yet. "You know," Sinatra said, his voice dropping slightly, taking on a different texture, "I've been doing this for a long time." He smiled. "And I think it's only fair that a man who can really sing gets a real chance to prove it." He gestured toward Elvis with an open hand, palm up. The kind of gesture you make when you're offering something or issuing a challenge. "Right here, right now, on this stage. Let's find out what you got, Elvis." There were maybe 3 full seconds of silence. Nobody in that ballroom moved. Not the musicians, not the camera operators, not Joey Bishop, who was standing to the left of the stage and would later tell people he felt the temperature in the room drop. Sinatra had not just introduced Elvis. He had called him out. in the most polished, velvet-gloved way imaginable, in front of a live television audience of tens of millions, Frank Sinatra had essentially said, "Prove it." Have you ever been in a room when something happens that everyone understands at exactly the same moment? That's what this was. Every person in that Fontainebleau ballroom, celebrity or crew member or camera operator, understood simultaneously what Sinatra had just done. He hadn't handed Elvis a microphone. He had handed him a test. Elvis walked to the microphone. He was 25 years old. He had been out of the army for 19 days. His last recording before Germany had been 2 years prior. There were serious people in serious rooms who believed his moment had passed, that the world had moved on while he was overseas pressing uniforms and keeping his head down. And now, the most respected entertainer in America had just stepped back from his own stage and said, in front of God and ABC and every famous face in Miami Beach, "Let's hear it." Sinatra stood a few feet to the side, hands clasped loosely in front of him, his expression patient and almost unreadable. Not hostile, not warm, watching. The way a man watches something he genuinely doesn't know the outcome of yet. The audience, the cameras, the entire room went completely still. And Elvis stood at the microphone looking at Frank Sinatra, understanding that whatever happened in the next few minutes would define the rest of his career. Elvis didn't smile, didn't look at the audience, didn't do anything that could be read as performing. He just opened his mouth and sang. And the sound that came out of him in that Fontainebleau ballroom stopped every person in that room cold. The song was Witchcraft, Frank Sinatra's song, one of his signature recordings, a song the audience in that room had heard Sinatra himself perform dozens of times. And now, here was this 25-year-old kid from Memphis, 2 years removed from army fatigues, standing in a tuxedo on Sinatra's own stage, singing it back to him. The arrangement had been worked out in advance. Elvis would sing Witchcraft. Sinatra would sing Love Me Tender, each man stepping into the other's world. But nobody in that ballroom was prepared for what it actually sounded like when it happened. The first thing people noticed wasn't the voice. It was the stillness. Elvis didn't move, didn't shake, didn't do any of the things that had made him famous and made Sinatra's generation furious. He just stood there and let the voice do everything. And that voice was something different in that room. In Las Vegas showrooms and concert arenas, Elvis's sound had power and scale and spectacle behind it. Here, in the Fontainebleau ballroom, with a big band arrangement and an audience of 50 people who knew exactly what great singing sounded like, there was nowhere to hide. No screaming teenagers to carry you. No hysteria to mistake for impact. Just the voice, the song, and the room. It was real. That's what hit people first. Pure and controlled and completely real. Joe Esposito, who was standing in the wings watching, later said the room changed in about 8 seconds. 8 seconds. That's how long it took. One phrase into Witchcraft, and the entire energy of that ballroom shifted from skeptical to something closer to stunned. The celebrities who had been leaning toward each other whispering went quiet. The photographers stopped moving. Even the band, the seasoned Sinatra musicians who had played with everyone and been impressed by almost nobody, seemed to pull themselves slightly more upright. Elvis was singing Sinatra's phrasing, But it wasn't an imitation. It was a conversation. He was taking the melody somewhere personal, bending certain words the way he'd learned from gospel singers in Tupelo, adding a weight to the bottom of certain notes that the original recording didn't have. It still sounded like Witchcraft, but it also sounded like Elvis. And somehow, those two things weren't fighting each other. They were the same thing. Sammy Davis Jr. was seated at a table near the front. He turned to Joey Bishop and said something. Bishop nodded slowly. Nobody heard what was said. They didn't have to. Have you ever been in a room when something sacred happened? When the air actually changes and you can feel that whatever is happening in front of you is going to matter? That's what people who were there described. Not excitement, not the feeling of watching a great performance, the feeling of watching something true. Then came Sinatra's turn. Frank Sinatra sang Love Me Tender the way only Frank Sinatra could, which is to say he made it sound like he'd written it himself. That was his gift, his lifelong, undefeated gift. He could inhabit a song so completely that the original author became irrelevant. He took Elvis's ballad and dressed it differently, slower, more deliberate, every syllable placed with the precision of a man who had been working on this craft since before Elvis was born. The audience laughed slightly, warmly at the beginning. They recognized the song. They understood the joke of it. But then Sinatra got about halfway through, and the room stopped laughing, because Sinatra meant it. That was the thing nobody had expected. He wasn't performing a gracious gesture. He wasn't doing a polished, professional favor for a younger colleague on national television. He was singing the song like it was his, which meant he was admitting, in front of everyone, that it was worth singing, that it deserved to be sung seriously, that the kid who wrote it had actually written something worth a man like Frank Sinatra taking seriously. That was the moment. That specific moment, Sinatra's voice wrapping itself around Elvis's melody with genuine care, is the moment people who were there point to when they describe what changed in that room. Before that moment, it was two icons sharing a stage for a broadcast. After it, something had been exchanged between them, something that couldn't be taken back. When Elvis stepped back up to the microphone to finish the song with Sinatra, their voices blending on the final chorus, the audience sat in almost total silence. Not the uncomfortable silence from earlier. Something entirely different. The silence of people who understood they were watching history and didn't want to miss a second of it. Frank Sinatra stood 3 feet away, listening, and the look on his face was something his closest friends said they had never seen before and never saw again. It was the look of a man hearing something he hadn't been sure still existed. Backstage, Frank Sinatra found Elvis before anyone else could, and he didn't shake his hand or offer the kind of polished professional compliment that celebrities exchange at events like this. He walked straight to him, put a hand on his shoulder, and pulled him away from the cameras and the crowd. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager, was standing close enough to hear. He later said Sinatra spoke quietly, almost like he didn't want the words to exist outside that corner of the room. What Sinatra said first was simple. You can sing. Not you were great tonight. Not good job out there. Just that. You can sing. Elvis, who had spent his whole career being told he was a phenomenon or an event or a cultural earthquake, stood there and didn't say anything. Because those three words from Frank Sinatra meant something different from everything else. They meant he was a singer, not just a sensation. Sinatra kept going. Charlie Hodge, who had been with Elvis since their Army days and knew him better than almost anyone, remembered Elvis repeating the conversation later that night, word for word, the way you replay something when you're trying to make it real. Sinatra told Elvis that what he'd heard out there wasn't what he expected. He said he'd been wrong. Not about rock and roll in general, not about the whole cultural argument, just about Elvis specifically. He said there was a difference between what Elvis did and what most of the others were doing, and he'd been too stubborn to see it. "I put you in a box," Sinatra reportedly said. "That was my mistake." That admission, coming from Frank Sinatra, was not a small thing. This was a man who didn't apologize. His own people said so. Peter Lawford, who was part of the Rat Pack and was backstage that same night, told a journalist years later that he'd never once heard Sinatra admit he was wrong about anything involving music. Not once. And here he was, in a hotel corridor in Miami Beach, saying it directly to the kid he'd called a cretinous goon by implication 3 years earlier. In the weeks after the broadcast, Sinatra's public tone shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but he stopped making the cutting remarks. Interviewers who asked him about rock and roll noticed that he'd give a short answer and move on instead of unloading. People in his circle said he'd made a private decision. You don't publicly mock something that can do what Elvis did on your own stage. It doesn't hold up. For Elvis, the weight of that backstage conversation went deeper than any review or chart position could reach. He had grown up with Sinatra's records. He had learned phrasing from them. He had told people close to him that Sinatra was the standard he measured himself against when it came to controlling a room, to making a lyric feel inevitable. And now, the man himself had stepped into a hallway and said it back to him. "You can sing." Elvis called Vernon that night from his hotel room. Vernon Presley was not an emotional man. He didn't embellish. When he told friends about the phone call later, he said Elvis kept going back to the same moment, kept saying what Sinatra had told him, kept trying to explain why it mattered so much. Vernon said it took him a while to understand. His son had sold millions of records and filled arenas and been on every magazine cover in the country. What could one man saying 3 words in a hotel corridor mean that all of that didn't already say? But Elvis knew. There are rooms you spend your whole life trying to get into, and when someone finally opens the door, nothing else feels quite the same. Elvis called his father from the hotel room that night, and Vernon Presley later told friends that his son sounded the way he had sounded as a little boy calling home after his first Assembly of God choir performance, like someone who couldn't quite believe they had been accepted somewhere they desperately wanted to belong. The broadcast drew over 40 million viewers, making it one of the most watched television specials of 1960. But the number that mattered most to Elvis had nothing to do with ratings. The morning after the special aired, Colonel Parker's office was flooded with calls. Not from teenagers, from adults. From the kind of people who had dismissed Elvis as a passing craze, a noise their kids made that would eventually go away. Those people had watched the Fontainebleau broadcast and seen something they hadn't expected to see. They'd seen a man who could hold a room. The critical reaction was immediate and sharp. Variety called it the most surprising television moment of the season. The New York Times, that had spent years treating Elvis as a sociological curiosity rather than an artist, ran a review that used words like poise and genuine musicianship. These were not words that had appeared in their previous Elvis coverage. Something had shifted in how the press saw him. A single night at the Fontainebleau was responsible for most of it. He had walked into Sinatra's world and not just survived it. He had belonged there. What that meant for his career was hard to overstate. The adult audience that opened up after that broadcast gave Elvis access to venues, films, opportunities that his teenage fan base alone could never have justified. His movie deals in the early 1960s leaned directly into the sophisticated, dressed-up image that the special had established. The tuxedo was no longer a costume. It was a credential. Colonel Parker understood this immediately and used the Sinatra broadcast as leverage in every negotiation for the next 3 years. Music historians have spent decades analyzing exactly what happened that night and why it mattered. The swap itself, Elvis singing Sinatra's music and Sinatra singing Elvis's, was not just a novelty, it was a statement. It said that the music on both sides of the generational divide was real music. It said neither man was canceling the other out. Peter Guralnick, who wrote the most thorough biography of Elvis ever assembled, described the broadcast as the moment when the cultural war over rock and roll effectively ended, not with a victory for either side, but with a mutual recognition that there were no sides. That's exactly what it felt like to the people in that room. The bootleg recordings that circulate among collectors are some of the most requested in Elvis's catalog. Not the polished broadcast version that aired on ABC. The rehearsal recordings. The off-camera moments where you can hear both men's voices loose and unguarded, trying things, adjusting, listening to each other. Those tapes have traded hands quietly for more than 60 years. Collectors describe them as something close to sacred, not because the singing is exceptional, because you can hear the conversation happening in real time. Two men from opposite sides of a cultural argument figuring out, note by note, that they actually spoke the same language. What that night reveals about Elvis, the man is something different from what it reveals about Elvis, the legend. The legend was fearless. The man was terrified. He walked into that ballroom knowing full well that Sinatra could have humiliated him, that the audience could have rejected him, that the press was watching for any sign that 2 years in the army had softened him into irrelevance. He went anyway. He dressed the way they wanted. He sang the songs they respected. He didn't demand that the room come to him. He walked across the room to meet it. That's not the behavior of an icon. That's the behavior of a young man from Tupelo who still needed to prove something, who still felt the distance between where he came from and where he was standing, who wasn't entirely sure, even then, that the distance had been crossed. He kept a photograph from that night for the rest of his life. The two of them standing together at the microphone. Sinatra, leaning in slightly. And people who visited Graceland said it was one of the few photos he ever displayed where he wasn't the one smiling.